The dust-laden wind howled through Rawhide, Nevada, carrying whispers that cut deeper than any knife. Theodora Hayes stood at her father's grave, her face as impassive as the weathered tombstone before her. Not a tear fell from her eyes, not because she didn't feel the loss, but because she couldn't remember how to cry anymore. 3 months since the tragedy that took not just her father, but her voice, her smile, and according to the townsfolk, her very soul. "Poor thing, Mrs. Abernathy muttered to the general store owner as Theodora walked past. "They say she'll never smile again, not after what happened." Theodora pretended not to hear, clutching her market basket tighter as she made her way down the dusty Main Street. The year was 1878, and Rawhide was experiencing an uncomfortable growth spurt as the silver mines expanded. New faces appeared daily, rough men with rough hands and rougher intentions, but Theodora noticed none of them. Her world had shrunk to the boundaries of her small ranch, the weekly trip to town for supplies, and the crushing weight of memories. The accident had been swift and merciless. The mine collapse took her father and left her buried for 2 days before they pulled her out, half dead and fully changed. Dr. Wilcox had set her broken bones and stitched her wounds, but pronounced with sad certainty that the trauma had damaged something inside her that medicine couldn't reach. "Some hurts go too deep," he'd said to her aunt who'd come to care for her. "She may never recover her spirits." Theodora was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the commotion until she nearly walked into it. A crowd had gathered around a newcomer, a tall man atop a magnificent chestnut horse. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, but even from where she stood, Theodora could see the determined set of his jaw. "Finnian Kincaid," he announced to the mayor, dismounting with easy grace. "I've come about the ranch foreman position at the Hayes place." Theodora froze. Her aunt had placed an advertisement without telling her, convinced that the once prosperous cattle ranch needed a strong hand to restore it. Anger flashed through her, the first real emotion she'd felt in months. The mayor spotted her standing at the edge of the crowd. "Well, speak of the devil. There's Miss Hayes herself. Though I warn you, Mr. Kincaid, she's not much for conversation these days." Finnian Kincaid turned, and Theodora felt the weight of his gaze as he assessed her. His eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. "Miss Hayes," he said, tipping his hat. "Pleasure to make your acquaintance." She gave a curt nod, unable to summon words for this stranger who thought he could waltz into her broken life. "She don't talk," offered old Pete from the livery stable. "Not since the accident. They say she'll never smile again, neither." Something flickered in the cowboy's eyes, not pity, which Theodora had grown to despise, but something akin to challenge. "Is that so?" Finnian said, never taking his eyes off her. A slight smile played at his lips as he spoke directly to her, ignoring the murmuring crowd. "Well, we'll just have to see about that, won't we, Miss Hayes?" 3 days later, Finnian Kincaid had settled into the foreman's cabin on the Hayes ranch. Theodora watched from her kitchen window as he worked from sunrise to sunset, mending fences, rounding up the scattered cattle, and somehow coaxing the ancient windmill back to life. His work was efficient, methodical, and infuriatingly impressive. Aunt Martha bustled around the kitchen, humming cheerfully. "That Mr. Kincaid is a godsend," she declared, setting down a plate of biscuits. "First time I've had hope for this place since your father passed." Theodora scribbled on the small slate she now carried, "We don't need him." Aunt Martha's expression softened. "Yes, dear, we do. You can't run this ranch alone, and I'm too old to be much help. Besides, I'll be heading back east next month." This was news to Theodora. She wrote frantically, "You're leaving me." "Not leaving you, child, giving you space to heal. You're 22 years old. It's time you stood on your own again." She patted Theodora's hand. And Mr. Kincaid seems very capable. Capable or not, Theodora resented his presence. Each morning, he would tip his hat to her and say, "Fine day for a smile, Miss Hayes." And each morning, she would stare stonily back at him before turning away. One afternoon, as rain clouds gathered on the horizon, Theodora rode out to her father's favorite spot, a small mesa overlooking the valley. She hadn't expected to find Finnian there, sitting with his back against a boulder, whittling a small piece of wood. He looked up, unsurprised. "Afternoon, Miss Hayes. Thought you might come up here today." She frowned. How could he have known storms coming? He explained, gesturing to the clouds. "Your father once told me this was the best place to watch the rain sweep across the valley." Her eyes widened. She scribbled quickly. "You knew my father," Finnian nodded, setting aside his whittling. "Briefly. Met him in Tucson 2 years back. He spoke highly of you and this ranch, said his daughter was the strongest, most stubborn woman west of the Mississippi." His eyes crinkled at the corners. Now I see he wasn't exaggerating. Theodora didn't know how to respond to that, so she sat a respectable distance away, watching as the first raindrops began to fall in the valley below. "I know what happened," Finnian said quietly, "about the mine collapse. I was passing through when they pulled you out." She stiffened, her hand automatically rising to touch the scar that ran along her jawline, usually hidden by her high collars. "I helped dig," he continued. "When they said there might still be survivors, I couldn't just ride on." He paused. "You fought hard to live, Miss Hayes. Seems a shame to stop fighting now." Anger flared in her chest. How dare he presume to know anything about her struggle? She stood abruptly, ready to leave, but he held out the small wooden carving he'd been working on. It was a tiny, perfect hummingbird, its delicate wings caught mid-flutter. "Your pa mentioned you loved these little fellows," Finnian said. "Said you used to sit for hours watching them at the garden flowers." The unexpected gesture caught her off guard. Theodora took the carving, running her finger over its smooth surface. Before she could stop herself, she wrote, "Thank you." Finnian smiled, not in triumph but with genuine warmth. "You're welcome, Miss Hayes." As the weeks passed, Theodora found herself gradually drawn into Finnian's efforts to revitalize the ranch. Though she still didn't speak, her slate became filled with questions, suggestions, and occasionally, grudging compliments on his ideas. He never pressed her to talk, seeming to accept her written communications as naturally as if they were having a normal conversation. The day Aunt Martha departed for Philadelphia was harder than Theodora had anticipated. Standing on the platform of the newly constructed train station, she felt a familiar panic rising. "You'll be fine," Aunt Martha assured her, cupping her cheek. "Write to me every week. And remember what Dr. Wilcox said, your voice isn't gone, it's just hiding until you're ready to use it again." As the train pulled away, Theodora felt utterly alone despite the crowded platform, until a tall figure appeared beside her. "Thought you might want company on the ride home," Finnian said, leading his horse and the buggy he'd driven Martha to the station in. On the journey back to the ranch, they passed the entrance to the Silver Creek mine, now abandoned after the collapse that had claimed a dozen lives, including her father's. Theodora always averted her eyes when passing this spot, but today she found herself staring at the boarded-up entrance. Finnian slowed the buggy. "Would you like to stop?" She hesitated, then nodded. They stood together before the mine entrance, the air heavy with more than just the afternoon heat. Theodora traced the warning sign with trembling fingers. "I was trapped under a beam," Finnian said suddenly. "Back in '71, Apache territory. Cave in during a flash flood. Thought I was dead for sure." Theodora looked at him in surprise. He'd never shared anything personal before. Took me nearly a year before I could enter any kind of enclosed space without feeling like I was choking. His eyes met hers. The fear doesn't go away, you just learn to carry it differently. She pulled out her slate. How, one day at a time, he offered his hand. And not alone. Theodora didn't take his hand, but as they walked back to the buggy, she stood a little closer to him than before. That evening, eating dinner alone in the big house felt unbearable. On impulse, Theodora packed up half the stew she'd made and carried it to the foreman's cabin. She knocked tentatively. Finnian opened the door, surprise evident on his face. "Miss Hayes." She held out the pot of stew and a hastily scribbled note. Too much for one person. His smile was warm as he stepped back to let her in. "I was just about to heat up some beans. This is a far sight better." The cabin was small but meticulously neat. Books were stacked on a small table: history, cattle breeding techniques, and to her surprise, a volume of poetry. "My mother insisted I get some education," he explained, catching her examining the books. "Said being a cowboy was no excuse for an uncultivated mind." As they ate, Finnian told stories of his travels across the West, from the Colorado Rockies to the California coast. Theodora found herself relaxed in his company, responding with notes that grew longer and more frequent. When she finally rose to leave, the clock showed that 3 hours had passed. At the door, Finnian said, "Thank you for the company, Miss Hayes. Been a while since I've had such a pleasant conversation." She raised an eyebrow, pointing to her slate. "Words are just one way people talk to each other," he said. "You say plenty without them." That night, Theodora dreamed of the mine collapse for the first time in months. But this time, as the rocks fell and darkness closed in, a hand reached for her. Finnian's hand. The next morning, she found him at the corral, breaking a spirited young mare. Theodora watched, impressed despite herself, as he worked patiently with the nervous animal. "Morning, Miss Hayes," he called, not taking his attention from the horse. "Beautiful day for a smile." She rolled her eyes at his daily greeting, but something had shifted between them after the previous evening. "This little lady reminds me of someone," he said, stroking the mare's neck as she finally allowed him to place a saddle on her back. "Stubborn, proud, but worth the patience." Theodora knew he wasn't just talking about the horse. She wrote, "Does everything have a hidden meaning with you?" He laughed. "Not hidden to those paying attention." Then, more seriously, "Some things are worth saying straight though, like how this ranch is starting to turn around. The new herd looks strong, and I've had inquiries about your cattle from buyers in Sacramento." She blinked in surprise. The ranch had been struggling since her father's death, barely breaking even. "We could drive 100 head to market next month," he suggested. "Prices are good right now." Theodora considered this. A cattle drive would mean hiring additional hands, something she'd avoided. More people meant more pitying looks, more whispers about poor mute Theodora Hayes. She wrote, "You think we're ready?" "I know we are," he said confidently. Then, softer, "Question is, are you?" Instead of answering, she wrote, "Show me the ledgers after dinner." That evening they sat at the kitchen table, going over the ranch accounts. Finnian had kept meticulous records, and Theodora was impressed by his business acumen. "My father would have liked you," she wrote, then immediately blushed at the implication. "I hope so," Finnian said, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "His opinion matters, but I'm more concerned with yours, Miss Hayes." The candlelight cast shadows that softened the planes of his face. For a moment, Theodora allowed herself to see him not just as her foreman, but as a man handsome, kind, and looking at her in a way that made her heart beat faster. She broke the gaze first, writing, "We'll need at least 4 more hands for the drive." "I know some good men," he replied, accepting her retreat to business. "Reliable, respectful." They worked late into the night, planning the cattle drive. When Finnian finally gathered his hat to leave, he paused at the door. "You know, Miss Hayes, a cattle drive means camping under the stars, long days in the saddle. It won't be easy." She wrote firmly, "I'm going with you." "Wouldn't have it any other way," he said with a smile that stayed with her long after he'd gone. Word spread quickly through Rawhide that the Hayes Ranch was hiring for a cattle drive. Within days, Finnian had selected 4 experienced cowboys. Theodora watched from the porch as he explained the work and his expectations. "One more thing," he said to the assembled men. "Miss Hayes will be riding with us. She's the boss, and you'll show her the same respect you'd show me. More, in fact." One of the men, a weathered cowboy named Ellis, glanced doubtfully toward Theodora. "No offense, miss, but the trail ain't no place for what?" Finnian interrupted, his voice dangerously soft. "For the woman who owns every head of cattle you'll be driving. For someone who survived being buried alive and still gets up every morning to run this ranch." Ellis had the grace to look abashed. "Just meant it'll be rough going, is all." "Miss Hayes is tougher than she looks," Finnian said, "and smarter than all of us put together. Any man who can't accept that can ride on now." No one moved. Theodora felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at Finnian's defense. Later, as they checked supplies in the barn, she wrote, "You didn't need to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied simply. "Not because you can't handle yourself, but because they needed to hear it." The preparation for the cattle drive consumed the next 2 weeks. Theodora threw herself into the work, riding out with Finnian to check the herds, helping to repair tack, and planning their route. Each day brought new challenges, but also a growing sense of purpose she hadn't felt since before the accident. The night before they were set to leave, Theodora couldn't sleep. She slipped out to the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the cool night air. The moon hung low and full, illuminating the ranch in silver light. "Can't sleep either," Finnian's voice came from the darkness. He approached from the direction of his cabin, hands in his pockets. She shook her head, wishing she'd brought her slate. "Nervous about tomorrow?" he asked, leaning against the porch railing. She nodded, then shrugged, trying to convey her mixed feelings. "It's natural to be anxious," he said. "But you're ready for this, Theodora. More than ready." It was the first time he'd used her given name instead of Miss Hayes, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the night chill. "I've been meaning to give you something," he said, pulling a small package from his pocket. "Thought it might come in handy on the trail." Theodora unwrapped the brown paper to find a beautiful leather-bound journal and pencil. "Figured it might be easier than that slate," Finnian explained. "More room to write, and I know you have plenty to say." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. She opened the journal to the first page and wrote, "Thank you, Finnian." When she looked up, he was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're welcome, Theodora." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Finnian cleared his throat. "We should both get some rest. Dawn comes early." She nodded, but as he turned to go, she impulsively reached out and touched his arm. He paused, looking back at her questioningly. Theodora opened the journal again and wrote, "I'm glad you're here." His smile in response was soft and genuine. "So am I." The cattle drive began at first light. 100 head of cattle moved slowly out of the Hayes Ranch, guided by Finnian, Theodora, and the 4 hired hands. Theodora rode alongside Finnian at the front, her back straight with determination despite her nervousness. "Remember," Finnian said, "we set the pace. Slow and steady for the first few days until they get into the rhythm." She nodded, her new journal secured in her saddlebag. The rising sun cast long shadows as they moved across the land her father had loved so much. For the first time since his death, Theodora felt connected to him again, carrying on his legacy. The days quickly fell into a pattern. Up before dawn, moving the herd until midday heat forced a rest, then pushing on until dusk. The work was hard but satisfying. At night, around the campfire, Finnian would tell stories that had even the most hardened cowboys laughing. Theodora found herself smiling more, though she tried to hide it behind her hand or turn away when she felt the expression form. One evening, as they sat a little apart from the others, Finnian said quietly, "You know, you don't have to hide when you smile." She looked up in surprise. Had she been so transparent, it's good to see, he continued, like watching flowers bloom after a long winter. Embarrassed but pleased, Theodora opened her journal. The town would be shocked. Let them be, he replied with a shrug. People like simple stories tragedy strikes, woman never smiles again, makes them feel they understand something they don't. She wrote, what do they not understand? That healing isn't simple. It doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't look the same for everyone. He poked at the fire with a stick. And that strength isn't about never breaking. It's about how you put yourself back together. Theodora studied his profile in the firelight. You sound like you know from experience. He was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, my wife died 6 years ago. Cholera. We'd been married just 8 months. Theodora's heart constricted. She'd never imagined Finnian married, though of course it made sense. A man like him wouldn't have remained single by chance. Her name was Sarah, he continued, his voice low. She loved to dance. Used to say life was too short not to find joy in small things. He smiled sadly. Took me 3 years before I could hear music without feeling like my chest was being crushed. Impulsively, Theodora wrote, what helped you? Time, distance, work. He looked at her directly, and eventually understanding that living fully again wasn't a betrayal of her memory, it was honoring it. The trail grew more challenging as they approached the mountains. A sudden storm scattered part of the herd, and they spent an exhausting day retrieving the strays. By nightfall, everyone was soaked, muddy, and irritable. We'll rest here tomorrow, Finnian announced. Let the cattle recover, dry out our gear. The men were visibly relieved, but Theodora was concerned about the delay. She wrote in her journal and showed it to Finnian. We're already behind schedule. Better to lose a day than push too hard and lose cattle, he replied. Or riders, he added pointedly, noting the dark circles under her eyes. She wanted to argue but was too exhausted. Her hands, unused to the constant roping and riding, were blistered and raw. As she struggled to unsaddle her horse, Finnian appeared beside her. Let me help, he said, gently moving her aside. Too tired to protest, Theodora allowed him to take over. When he finished, he took her hands in his, examining the blisters by the light of the rising moon. You should have said something, he admonished softly. She pulled her hands back, embarrassed by both the state of them and the tingles his touch had sent up her arms. Come on, he said. I've got some salve in my saddlebag. In the shelter of a small tent, Finnian carefully cleaned and treated her blistered hands. His touch was gentle, his large hands surprisingly dexterous as they wrapped bandages around her palms. There, he said when he finished. Should feel better by morning. Thank you, she wrote awkwardly with her bandaged hand. He smiled. Get some rest, Theodora. That's an order from your foreman. She nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by his proximity in the small tent. The rain pattered softly on the canvas above them, creating a strangely intimate atmosphere. Good night, he said, ducking out of the tent. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded Theodora. Her thoughts kept returning to Finnian, his kindness, his strength, the way his hands had felt on hers. The realization that she was falling in love with him came not as a shock, but as the simple acknowledgement of something that had been growing for months. The weather cleared the next day, but as promised, they remained camped to rest. Theodora found Finnian by the creek, washing his shirt. She wrote, "The men are playing cards. I thought you'd be joining them." "Never been much for gambling," he replied, wringing out his shirt. "Prefer to save my risks for things that matter." Water droplets clung to his bare shoulders, and Theodora found herself having to look away. She wrote, "Like what?" He thought for a moment. "Like taking a job on a struggling ranch run by a woman everyone said would never smile again." His eyes met hers. "Some risks are worth taking." The weight of his words hung between them. Theodora's heart hammered in her chest as she realized he was waiting for some sign from her. Slowly, deliberately, she smiled at him, a real smile that reached her eyes. Finnian's face transformed with answering joy. "There it is," he said softly. "Even more beautiful than I imagined." Blushing, she wrote, "Don't get used to it." "Too late," he laughed. "Now I've seen it, I'll be looking for that smile every day." The remainder of the cattle drive passed without major incident. They reached Sacramento ahead of the adjusted schedule, and Finnian negotiated a better price for the cattle than they'd anticipated. As they prepared to begin the journey home, with considerably lighter loads and heavier purses, the atmosphere was celebratory. "We did it," Finnian said as they rode side by side. "First successful Hayes cattle drive in years." Theodora nodded, a sense of pride filling her. She'd proven to herself that she could do this, that her father's legacy was safe in her hands. And she hadn't done it alone. That night, at a proper inn for the first time in weeks, Theodora took a long bath and changed into a clean dress. She'd arranged to meet Finnian for dinner in the hotel restaurant, away from the men who were celebrating more raucously in the saloon. When she entered the restaurant, Finnian stood, and the appreciation in his eyes made her flush. He'd cleaned up as well, his usual trail clothes replaced by a crisp white shirt and dark vest. "You look beautiful," he said simply as he held her chair. She'd brought her journal, of course, and wrote, "You clean up well yourself, Cowboy." Dinner was a leisurely affair, with good food and better company. They discussed the success of the drive, plans for the ranch, and shared stories from their pasts. It felt like the most natural thing in the world when Finnian reached across the table and took her hand. "Theodora," he said, his voice low and serious. "I need to say something." She nodded, her pulse quickening. "I came to your ranch looking for work, not this," he gestured between them. "But I find myself thinking about you all the time, your courage, your determination, the way you listen. The way you see things others miss." He took a deep breath. "I'm falling in love with you." Her eyes widened. Although she'd suspected his feelings, hearing them stated so plainly was overwhelming. "You don't need to say anything," he continued, "or write anything. I just wanted you to know where I stand." Theodora reached for her journal with trembling hands and wrote a single word. "Why?" Finnian looked confused. "Why what?" she elaborated. "Why me? I'm broken. I don't speak. The whole town pities me." His expression softened. "You're not broken, Theodora. You're healing. And as for why you..." He shook his head, smiling. "How could it be anyone else? You're the strongest person I've ever met." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wrote, "I think I'm falling in love with you too." The smile that spread across his face was blinding in its joy. "Well," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I guess we're both taking that risk on something that matters." The journey back to Rawhide took less time without the cattle to move. Theodora was eager to get home, to see her ranch through new eyes. The future suddenly seemed full of possibilities instead of burdens. As they crested the final hill overlooking the valley, Theodora reined in her horse. The Hayes ranch spread out below them, the afternoon sun gilding the buildings and pastures. Finnian stopped beside her. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" she nodded, then turned to look at him directly. For weeks now, something had been building inside her, a pressure in her throat, words forming but never released. Looking at Finnian, at the love in his eyes and the future they might build together, she finally found the courage to try. "Home," she whispered, the words scraping painfully past disused vocal cords. Finnian's eyes widened in shock. "Theodora, home," she repeated, slightly stronger this time. "With you." He was off his horse in an instant, lifting her down from her saddle and into his arms. "You spoke," he said, wonder in his voice. "You actually spoke." She nodded, tears flowing freely now. "For you," she managed, her voice raspy and weak but undeniably there. Finnian kissed her then, tenderly and reverently, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When they separated, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Theodora Hayes," he said. "I love you, Finnian Kincaid," she whispered back, each word a victory. News of Theodora's recovery spread quickly through Rawhide. When they rode into town to purchase supplies a few days later, they were met with astonished stares and excited whispers. "It's true then," Mrs. Abernathy said, approaching them outside the general store. "You're talking again." Theodora nodded. "A little," she said, her voice still soft but growing stronger with daily practice. "And smiling too," the older woman observed, glancing between Theodora and Finnian. "I never thought I'd see the day." "People can surprise you," Finnian said, his hand resting protectively at Theodora's back. "Indeed they can," Mrs. Abernathy agreed. "Indeed they can." As summer turned to fall, the Hayes ranch flourished under their combined care. Theodora's voice grew stronger, though she still spoke sparingly, choosing her words with care. She continued to use the journal Finnian had given her, filling it with plans for the ranch, observations, and increasingly, her feelings for him. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Finnian took her hand. "I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous," she teased, her voice warm. He smiled. "Maybe so, but I've been thinking that foreman's cabin is awful small." "Oh," she raised an eyebrow, "and this house is awful big for just one person." He turned to face her fully. "What I'm trying to say, not very well, is that I love you, Theodora. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and hear your voice, even if it's just a few words, and see your smile, which thankfully isn't so rare these days." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me?" Theodora's heart felt too full for her chest. "Yes," she said clearly, without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married in October, with the aspen trees blazing gold against the mountains. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, curious to witness the union of Theodora Hayes, who they'd written off as a tragic figure, and the cowboy who had helped her find her voice and her smile again. "I told you," Finnian whispered to her during their first dance. "I told them all they'd see you smile again." "You were right," she replied, her voice carrying the melody of happiness. "You just had to show me how." 3 years later, Theodora stood on that same porch, watching as Finnian taught their 2-year-old son, Thomas, to feed the chickens. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, where their second child grew stronger each day. The Hayes Ranch, now the Hayes Kincaid Ranch, had become one of the most successful in the territory. They'd expanded their operations, built a new barn, and hired more permanent hands. But the greatest transformation wasn't in the land or the buildings, it was in Theodora herself. She still had nightmares sometimes, still felt the phantom weight of rocks pressing down on her. But now, when she woke gasping in the night, Finnian was there to hold her, to remind her she was safe, to love her through the fear until it subsided. And every morning, without fail, he greeted her the same way. "Beautiful day for a smile, Mrs. Kincaid." Finnian joined her on the porch, lifting Thomas into his arms. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" he asked. Theodora smiled, the expression now as natural as breathing. About how everyone said I'd never smile again. And I said, "Watch her now," he finished, leaning in to kiss her softly. "Watch me now," she agreed, her voice strong and sure, filled with the promise of all the smiles yet to come. As the years passed, the story of Theodora Hayes and Finnian Kincaid became something of a legend in Rawhide. People spoke of the woman who lost her smile and the cowboy who helped her find it again. Some romanticized it, others embellished the details, but the heart of the story remained true. By 1895, the Hayes-Kincaid Ranch had grown to be one of the largest operations in Nevada. Theodora and Finnian had 4 children: Thomas, now 19 and studying at university in San Francisco; Elizabeth, 16 and as headstrong as her mother; William, 13 and already showing Finnian's skill with horses; and Rebecca, their surprise blessing, who had arrived when Theodora was 40, now a precocious 7-year-old who followed her father everywhere. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Finnian surprised Theodora by taking her back to the mesa where they had watched the rainstorm together all those years ago. They rode up at dawn, just the 2 of them, to watch the sunrise. "Remember the first time we came here?" Finnian asked, his arm around her waist as they sat side by side. "You gave me that wooden hummingbird," Theodora said, her voice now as natural and fluid as if it had never been silent. "I still have it on my dresser." "You thought I was presumptuous," he chuckled. "You were," she replied with a smile. "And right." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the golden light spread across their land. Gray streaked Finnian's once dark hair, and laugh lines crinkled the corners of Theodora's eyes, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the same people who had fallen in love on that cattle drive so many years ago. "Was it worth it?" Finnian asked suddenly. "All of it." "The struggle, the pain, building this life together?" Theodora turned to him, cupping his weathered cheek in her hand. "Every moment," she said firmly, "even the darkest ones. They led me to you, to our children, to this life we've made. No regrets," she shook her head. "Not one." He kissed her then, with all the tenderness and passion of their first kiss. "I love you, Theodora Hayes Kincaid, more today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied. "My cowboy who always believed I could smile again." Later that evening, the entire family gathered for a celebration dinner. The long table in the dining room was filled with children, ranch hands who had become like family, and friends from town. Theodora looked around at the faces of those she loved, at the life she and Finnian had built together, and felt a deep contentment. Thomas proposed a toast, raising his glass. "To my parents, who taught us all that love can heal even the deepest wounds." 20 years together, and still looking at each other like lovesick calves. Everyone laughed, including Theodora, her voice ringing out clear and joyful. Who would have believed, all those years ago when she stood mute and grief-stricken at her father's grave, that she would find such happiness? After dinner, as the younger children played and the adults conversed, Elizabeth approached her mother on the porch. "Mama," she said hesitantly, "I wanted to ask you something." "What is it, dear?" Theodora asked, noting her daughter's serious expression. "Is it true what they say? That you didn't speak or smile for almost a year after grandfather died?" Theodora nodded slowly. "It's true, the mind collapse. It broke something in me, or I thought it did." "But Papa fixed you?" Elizabeth asked. Theodora smiled softly. "No, not exactly. Your father didn't fix me. He showed me that I wasn't broken to begin with, that my voice and my smile were still there, waiting for me to find my way back to them." She took her daughter's hand. "The heart is stronger than we know, Elizabeth. It can weather terrible storms and still beat on." Elizabeth leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "I'm glad you found each other," "So am I," Theodora agreed. "So am I." Later that night, after the children had gone to bed and the house had quieted, Theodora and Finnian sat on the porch swing, his arm around her shoulders as they gazed at the star-filled sky. "You remember what you wrote in your journal the night you first told me you loved me?" Finnian asked. "I wrote a lot of things in that journal," she replied with a smile. "You wrote, 'I'm afraid to be happy again,' and I told you, that happiness isn't something we find once and keep forever," she finished. "It's something we choose every day, even when it's difficult." He squeezed her shoulder. "Wisest thing I ever said." "Don't get too full of yourself," she laughed. "You also said the new bull wouldn't cause any trouble, and he broke through 3 fences last month." "Details," he dismissed with a wave of his hand. "The point is, you chose happiness, Theodora. Every day, through all the hardships, the droughts, the difficult births, the children's illnesses, you chose joy." "We chose it," she corrected gently. "Together." They sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the rustle of wind through the cottonwood trees Finnian had planted when Thomas was born. 20 more years?" Finnian asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "At least," Theodora agreed, turning to meet his lips with hers. "After all, I'm just getting started on all these smiles you promised me." In the years that followed, the Hayes Kincaid Ranch continued to thrive, weathering the changing times as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. Theodora and Finnian grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. They welcomed grandchildren, modernized the ranch operations, and became respected elders in a community that had once whispered about poor mute Theodora. When visitors came to Rawhide, locals would often point out the handsome older couple at church or in town, their hands still intertwined after decades of marriage. "See them," they'd say. "They have quite a story. They say she never spoke or smiled after the terrible accident, until he came along. They said she'd never smile again, but the cowboy said, 'Watch her now.'" And invariably, as if on cue, Theodora would laugh at something Finnian said, her face lighting up with a joy that had been hard-won but was no less radiant for the struggle it took to find it. For in the end, theirs was not just a love story but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the truth that even in our darkest moments, healing is possible, joy can be rediscovered, and sometimes all it takes is someone who believes in us enough to say, "Watch her now."